chapter 13, verse 24 through 30, and verse 36 through 43. And the scripture reads, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sows good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seeds in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servant asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them out?" "No," he replied, "because while you are pulling out the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn." Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is at the end times of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. Then they will throw them into the blazing furnace, where they will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteousness will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ear, let them hear." The word of the Lord. As you can see from this parable, Jesus not only told the parable, but he explained it. And from that perspective, y'all can see why 3 years ago when I read this passage, I skipped over it and did the Romans passage. And also why when I messed up last week and preached last week, this week's message, I had to switch to this passage in Rome, from the Romans to this, for I preached the Romans 3 years ago. But at the same time, I think it was good because not only interpreting this parable as Jesus interpreted it, but as I read and reread it, it reminded me of a book that I recently reread by James Allen. This is an older book written in 1903, As a Man Thinketh. And the big difference between that story and this was James Allen compared the mind to a garden or to a field. And that in life that we need to plant the good things, but we need to do what? Weed or garden. And so today's sermon is titled, "Good and Bad Live Side by Side." The truth is, I have tried gardening in the past. About 14 years ago, when we first moved to where we live, my wife, because we were at the stage of life where we were with the kids at home and more people eating, in order to save money, we planted a garden. The first year, the garden was a wreck. And the reason it was a wreck, I started off, made a huge garden, and because gardening requires work, I had to weed it, and I had to water it. After about a couple weeks, I quit weeding. And the girls call it the garden of survival of the fittest. And guess what happened? It was not a bumper crop. It was a terrible crop. Except for the few plants that the wife and daughters weeded and kept up, the rest of it was overgrown.
The weeds were taller than the plants, choked out the sun. And what was worse, some of the weeds even choked the plants themselves, and we had little or no garden. Here, I prepared the ground. I planted good seeds. Did I have to plant the weeds? No, they just come up. I mean, that's the way life is, isn't it? Do we have to plant bad stuff? No, it just, But here's the thing. In life, good and evil, good and bad lives where? Side by side. I mean, that's reality. And if we think that that's not reality, we're in for a rude awakening. That year, the first year I planted that garden and survival of the fittest, I got little or no garden produce. The following year, I planted a smaller garden and I weeded it. And what I discovered about gardening is it's easier to weed when the weeds are what? Small, than it is to wait a couple weeks and then go out and the weeds are big and you have to work really hard. And y'all know me, I'm lazy when it comes to gardening. And so I figured out if I weed twice a week, it was what? Easy, because it was easy to get the weeds when they were small. Jesus pointed out in this parable about the earth. But the reality is, I want to narrow that down to just an individual. Let's be realistic. Good and evil resides where? In me, in you, in each and every one of us. And the garden plot doesn't care what you plant. The same is true with our mind. It doesn't matter what we plant in our mind. If we plant good stuff, we get good. If we plant bad stuff, here's the truth though. Just like a garden, we don't have to plant weeds. We don't have to plant what? Bad stuff in our minds. It's just, think about it. Almost all the news in the world is what? Is it good news? No, it's bad news. I can tell you, as a matter of fact, once they tried to make a good news newspaper, guess what happened? Went out of business. People pay for what? News, and it's always bad. Some plane crash, some bombing, some killings. It's always bad. There's a lot. We don't have to plant the weeds in our lives, but we do have to be intentional in planting the what? The good things. And so that's what the servants say. Did you plant good seeds? Back then they used to scatter the seeds. They didn't plant it in nice rows. Even today, the farmers do what? They weed. They till. They go back over and get all the weeds. We need to pull the weeds in our lives. We need to pull the what? The bad things. Far too often, though, a lot of us just let them do exactly like this parable. Let them grow. And we allow good and bad to be in our lives. But as Christians, we are reminded we are supposed to think about what? The good things, the positive things. That, unfortunately, the bad thing comes along, and we don't pull them out, and if you let a weed grow, what happens? You get bigger and choke out the good. The way life is. I was reminded of another story. I was a pastor, had a small church, and one of the things I found out, there's no difference between a small church and a big church. They both have problems. And this one lady, who was a single mom, had a teenager who was a handful. And I mean, he was a handful. He would sneak out at night, get into trouble. And so she came to me, trying as pastor to help this kid. At that point in time, I had little kids, babies. And I tried as much as I can to help this kid. But what I realized was that sooner or later, the way this kid was going, he would end up where? In trouble, and more likely in prison. And sure enough, he got in more and more trouble. And what I realized about it, it is easier to weed the bad stuff out of our life when it's what? It's small. This lady waited until she had a teenager, and this teenager had developed problems all along. And those problems were what now? big problems. And what I learned from that is, and this is mainly for these kids here and parents, it's easier to deal with your problem when it's what? When it's small. Well, how many of us allow the problem to grow? By the time you're a teenager, sometimes it's too late to correct the bad behavior. And the same is true for our lives. It's easier for us to deal with the problems while they're what? Small. But let that weed grow and take root. I know every once in a while, on my little acreage, I forget to pull up some of the weeds. And especially those that are trees. And you know how hard it is to pull out a small tree?
Yeah.
Very difficult. But isn't that what we do in our lives? We get something that is small in our lives, small problem, and we let it what? Grow. Rather than deal with it. Our minds are that way. We can plant good stuff or we don't have to plant bad stuff. We all want the good stuff in life. We all want the good life. But is it going to happen, the survival of the fittest garden? No. You have to plant the good stuff. You have to water it. You have to weed it. And you have to wait for a long time for the garden to what? Produce the good crop. The problem is, in our society, in our life, we want the good stuff and we want it what? Now. We are instant gratification society. Not realizing that it takes time. We have to plant the good stuff in our minds. We have to water it. It takes time. We have to weed it. And if you don't weed it, the weeds will take over. Jesus is right. There will be a time of harvest. In this story, they pulled the weeds, they burnt it. But the harvest, I am sure, because the weeds took away nutrition and sunlight and all the other valuable things that the plant needs, was less than it could have been. The question is, how are we going to apply this to our lives? Are we going to pull the weeds? Some weeds in our lives, let me be realistic, we've neglected them and they're big problems now. We're going to have to take some work to get rid of it. The earlier we deal with it, the what? The easier. The earlier, even with the plants, one that get up a little high and the wife say, hey, you forgot that one, I have to go pull it out. It's a lot easier than pulling out a what? A tree. A lot easier. So no matter what your problem is, it's a lot easier if you deal with it what? Now. Don't wait months and years till they become teenagers or young adults. Deal with the problems early as parents, grandparents. And whatever issue you're facing, whatever problem, deal with it early. The word of the Lord.